Most limits are not obvious when they are first approached. They do not appear as barriers standing in the way, clearly marking where something should stop. Instead, they often feel distant, abstract, or even unnecessary. When progress is steady and growth continues without resistance, it becomes easy to believe that those limits either do not exist or can be overcome with enough effort. The story of Babel exists within that moment, the point where ambition moves forward without interruption and begins to assume that there is nothing left that can push back. It is not simply a story about a tower. It is a story about what happens when something grows without recognizing the boundaries that make that growth sustainable. The people in the story of Babel are not divided at the beginning. They share a common language, a unified way of understanding each other, and that unity allows them to operate as a single system. There is no miscommunication, no fragmentation, no barriers between individuals that prevent ideas from moving freely. That kind of unity creates a level of efficiency that is difficult to disrupt. It allows for coordination on a scale that would not be possible otherwise, and with that coordination comes the ability to attempt something much larger than anything that came before it. The people decide to build both a city and a tower that will extend upward toward the heavens. This is not framed as a small project or an isolated structure. It is something meant to define them, something that establishes their presence and ensures that they are not scattered. At its core, the project represents more than construction. It represents the desire to remove distance, to eliminate separation, to reach beyond what is normally accessible. And because the system they are working within is unified, there is nothing immediately stopping them from continuing that effort. At first, the process works. The tower rises, the system holds, and collaboration remains intact. Every piece fits into place because there is no friction within the structure. Everyone understands the same instructions, follows the same direction, and contributes to the same outcome. That kind of alignment creates the illusion that progress can continue indefinitely. It reinforces the idea that if something is working, it will continue to work as long as it is maintained. But that assumption begins to ignore something important. It ignores the possibility that the system itself may not be designed to extend as far as it is being pushed. The issue is not that the tower is poorly built, or that the effort lacks coordination. The issue is that the direction of that effort removes the concept of limits entirely. The goal is not to build within a structure, but to extend beyond it. And when something is built with that intention, it begins to move into a space where the normal balance no longer applies. Growth without limits does not remain stable, even if it appears to function in the moment. It accumulates pressure in ways that are not immediately visible. The response in the story is not a direct destruction of the tower. It is something more subtle and more disruptive. Their language is divided, and communication becomes fractured. The unified system that allowed the tower to exist in the first place is broken into pieces, and once that happens, the tower can no longer sustain itself. The same effort that once moved everything forward now creates confusion, and without that foundation, the project cannot continue. The structure itself is not the first thing to collapse. The system supporting the tower collapses first. The ability to function as a single unit is what allowed the tower to grow, and once that ability is removed, the growth stops naturally. The project does not need to be destroyed directly, because it can no longer sustain itself without the system that created it, revealing something important about how limits operate. They do not always appear as physical barriers. Sometimes they emerge through the breakdown of the systems that encouraged unchecked expansion. Systems that grow without acknowledging limits often do not fail because of a single event. They fail because the structure that supports them becomes unstable. The same factors that once created efficiency begin to create friction, and once that friction reaches a certain point, the system cannot continue in the same direction. It does not always collapse immediately, but it stops moving forward in the way it once did and slows down. Babel reflects that idea in a clear way. It shows how unity can create strength, but also how that same unity, when directed without limits, can lead to a point where the system must be disrupted to prevent it from continuing indefinitely. The story is usually understood as an argument against ambition, but the story does not argue against ambition. It does not suggest that building, creating, or expanding is inherently wrong. What it does highlight is the importance of limits within that process. Without limits, growth loses structure. It becomes something that can no longer regulate itself, something that continues without recognizing where it should stop or adjust. Once that happens, the correction does not come from within the system, it comes from something that disrupts it entirely. This is where the story connects to us in a more familiar way. We as people push both ourselves and the systems we create forward as long as progress is visible. As long as something is working, there is little reason to question it, but that progress can mask underlying instability, especially when it is not balanced by limits. Over time, that instability builds, and when it reaches a certain point, it forces a change that feels sudden, even though it was developing long before it became visible. The division in Babel represents that moment, not the beginning of failure, but the point where failure becomes visible. The tower does not stop because it suddenly becomes impossible to build. It stops because the conditions that made it possible no longer exist. And once those conditions are gone, the effort cannot continue in the same way, no matter how much momentum it had before. The question the story leaves behind is not whether something can be built to reach beyond its limits. It is whether those limits can be ignored without consequence. Because even if they are not immediately visible, they still exist. And when they are pushed far enough, the response is not always gradual. It can appear as a sudden disruption, even though it is the result of something that has been building over time. Babel is not just a story about a tower that was never finished. It is a reflection of what happens when growth moves forward without recognizing the boundaries that make that growth sustainable. It shows how systems depend on balance, how progress depends on structure, and how removing limits does not create infinite expansion. It creates conditions where something eventually has to push back, not to stop growth entirely, but to reintroduce the balance that was removed in the process. Limits do not disappear simply because we ignore them. They remain even when progress makes them feel invisible, and when they are pushed far enough, something eventually pushes back.